Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be going through chapter 3 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I think this will just be a one-part video, but we'll see how it goes. Maybe it'll be a two-parter. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. So we get our first set of quite positive, how do I say this, like physical attributes of Dr. Jekyll. So he's described as being a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50. So this is quite positive. And you've got to remember that, you know, the connotations of well-made and smooth-faced are all very, very positive. And the Victorians, they put together anyone that was good-looking as being more moral. There was a prejudice at the time, and a kind of a belief that the uglier you were, the more immoral you were. And that's part of why Dr. Jekyll is this tall, dark and handsome kind of guy, well-groomed, pretty much the epitome of the Victorian gentleman, whereas Mr. Hyde is this kind of dark, small, sinister little gremlin creature. And it's meant to be a blatant juxtaposition between them to make Dr. Jekyll appear good and Victorian gentleman, and Mr. Hyde appear bad and villain. And so this is an important first quote about how Dr. Jekyll is presented. He's describing or talking about his friend Lanyon. So in the previous chapter, we saw that Dr. Lanyon was describing Dr. Jekyll as being unscientific, and his methods were balderdash, unscientific balderdash, one of the big quotes from Lanyon. Whereas here we have Dr. Jekyll's side, and he's saying that Dr. Lanyon is a hide-bound pedant, an ignorant, blatant pedant. I was never more disappointed in any man than Lanyon. So we see that the two of them have been arguing about science a lot, and Dr. Lanyon represents a more traditional view of science, whereas Dr. Jekyll represents a more progressive, pushing forwards, cutting edge, shall we say, view of science. So we see that Dr. Jekyll is not happy with Dr. Lanyon, and all of this links into what we would consider a subversion of expectations. We don't expect Victorian gentlemen to gossip about each other, and at this time, reputation was everything. So the fact that Dr. Lanyon has been trying to kind of dampen Dr. Jekyll's reputation and vice versa, this would have been seen by the Victorian reader as quite scandalous and not really something that you should have done. The conversation moves over to Mr. Hyde, and Mr. Utterson explains that he's actually now learned a bit more about Mr. Hyde, and obviously he's met Mr. Hyde, and notice that immediately the large handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the very lips. So there is this odd little transformation in Dr. Jekyll's face. For the worse, it looks more ill and sickly, even at the mention of Mr. Hyde's name. So that could easily be foreboding the fact that Dr. Jekyll actually is Mr. Hyde. And also the juxtaposition between his handsome face turning pale, it suggests that Mr. Hyde is kind of making things worse, in effect. Things are worse as a result of Mr. Hyde being present. I'd go a little bit deeper as well, especially when you add in the blackness about Dr. Jekyll's eyes, that maybe subtly this is talking about addiction. Because when an addict is faced with whatever he or she is addicted to, there can be a little bit of a change in their body as a result of that. And obviously Dr. Jekyll is addicted to being Mr. Hyde. And it's also his darkest, worst secret. So there's a lot there. And again, it links into the idea that the uglier or worse looking, less aesthetic you were, the more guilty you seemed. So this drop from his handsomeness to a pale face with darkness in his eyes, I think it all forebodes that he actually is Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll says that he would trust Mr. Utterson before himself even, if he could make the choice. And there's a semicolon here as well, which I think emphasizes that moment even more. And I think, again, that is a bit of an odd thing to say, but why would you not trust yourself? So that again might be foreboding, but it also shows the bond between Mr. Utterson and Dr. Jekyll here for sure. Sorry about that. I had to pause the video because my robot butler was starting to hoover and I was just worried it was going to get into the audio. Anyway, so there's also an arrogance to Dr. Jekyll. He says, the moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. There is a kind of a naivety, I think, to Dr. Jekyll at this point, and dare I say even an arrogance. And in some ways, that could be considered to be his fatal flaw. And he's quite defensive, Dr. Jekyll, when Mr. Hyde is being talked about by Mr. Utterson. He doesn't want to talk about this. So we've got a colon, we've got a semicolon. All of this section is much slower, which seems to suggest that Dr. Jekyll is being a lot more deliberate and careful with his words. The pace is much slower. And then he finishes with, this is a private matter, and I beg of you to let it sleep. So what Dr. Jekyll is doing in terms of context is he's appealing to Mr. Utterson's sense of decency. He's saying, Mr. Utterson, this isn't something I'm comfortable with. Gossip isn't something us Victorian gentlemen are supposed to engage in anyway. You're effectively committing a little bit of what we would call a faux pas, which basically means he's just sort of putting his foot in his mouth. He's talking about something that he's not really supposed to be talking about at this point, and he's trying to get Mr. Utterson, to put it bluntly, to shut up, to stop talking. And Mr. Utterson isn't happy about this. He says, Dr. Jekyll presses him and says that if he is to disappear suddenly, mysteriously, that he wants Mr. Utterson to look after him. I wish you to promise me that you will bear with him and get his rights for him. And this is just a very odd thing considering how awful Mr. Hyde is. And Utterson agrees to it, but only because of the sake of their lifelong friendship, not because he actually likes Mr. Hyde, and he can't imagine ever liking Mr. Hyde. So it's quite a mysterious chapter. We get a different side of Dr. Jekyll. We get that his Victorian gentleman status is sort of almost challenged when Mr. Hyde is mentioned. There's a bit of gossip, mystery, secrecy. Dr. Jekyll clearly doesn't want to talk about it. But he's also leveraging his friendship with Mr. Utterson here. And because Mr. Utterson is very loyal as a friend, he does agree to help Mr. Hyde in spite of the fact that he does not like him and gets a bad impression of him when he meets him earlier on in chapter 2. So that's chapter 3. We'll go into chapter 4 in the next one.